"I am not going to make a speech," he said. "Good," she said. "I wouldn't trust a speech at this point." Something moved in his face. "I want to tell you what this is," he said, "so there is no ambiguity." "Tell me," she said. "This is not a transaction," he said. "It is not a strategy. It is not an alliance or an arrangement or a partnership in the business sense, though I believe we will always be all of those things as well." He paused. "This is me telling you that I have spent 73 years building things and losing things and surviving things, and I have not until this particular year understood what it felt like to be beside someone who made me want to be the best version of what I actually am." She was very still. "You did that," he said, "not by needing anything from me, not by being impressed by me, or afraid of me, or dependent on me, by being exactly what you are and expecting me to rise to meet it." He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, a single stone set cleanly with no excess, the ring of a man who understood that the most powerful things did not need ornamentation to announce themselves. "This is not a symbol of ownership," he said. "I want to be precise about that. I have been around enough arrangements that called themselves partnerships and were actually ownership to know the difference." "What is it then?" she said. "It is a symbol of the choice to do this together," he said. "Whatever this is and whatever it becomes. The company, the restructure, the Southeast Asian routes Claire keeps emailing me about, all of it and whatever comes after all of it." He paused. "If you want." Madison looked at the ring. She looked at the man holding it 73 years old with a complicated history and an honest present and a future that was being rebuilt from the ground up with the same careful precision that her father had used to build a company from a single freight contract and a borrowed office in Red Hook. She thought about the night she had driven to Ethan's apartment with a bottle of champagne and the best news her company had received in 6 months, wanting to share it with the man she thought she loved. She thought about sitting on a bench in the rain with her life dissolving around her. She thought about a back room, a phone on a table, a recording playing in silence. She thought about what her father had said in that hospital room. Protect the company. She had. She had protected it with everything she had, and then kept going, and then built it into something larger, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, she had also, without planning to protect it herself, the part of herself that was capable of this, of sitting on a couch on a Sunday evening and looking at a ring held by a man who had seen her clearly and chosen her anyway. Her father had not said anything about that part, but she thought he would have approved. "Yes," she said. She said it the way she said everything that mattered directly, without performance, with the full weight of a woman who meant exactly what she said, and nothing more and nothing less. Vincent placed the ring on her finger. His hands were steady, so were hers. The next morning, Madison Carter arrived at Carter Maritime at 7:15, the same time she always arrived, with her coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, and the ring on her finger catching the morning light in the elevator. She walked through the operations center, past 14 people, managing 17 active shipping routes, 18 now since the new Baltimore expansion had come online 2 weeks earlier. She said good morning to Marcus, who had been with this company for 20 years, and who looked at her hand and looked at her face and said nothing except a quiet, warm, knowing smile. She sat down at her father's desk. Her desk. She had an 8 o'clock meeting with Claire about the Southeast Asian route proposal. She had a 10:30 call with Howard in Baltimore. She had a 1 o'clock review of the quarterly financials that showed Carter Maritime on track for its largest revenue year since the company's founding. She had a company to run. She had a future being built beside a man who had spent 7 months proving that respect was not the same as control, and that strength was not the same as dominance, and that the most dangerous and valuable thing one person could offer another was the willingness to see them clearly and choose them anyway. She had a promise she had kept, and a father she had not let down, and 400 people who showed up every morning because the name on the building meant something honest. She had, for the first time in her life, exactly what she had been building toward without knowing it. She opened her laptop. She took a drink of her coffee. Outside her window, the ships moved across the harbor, slow and certain, and carrying their weight with the complete indifference of things that had already decided where they were going. Madison Carter had decided too, and she was already there. The morning Adrian Moretti walked out of prison, he did not breathe in the air. He did not look at the sky. He turned to the only man waiting for him and said 4 words in a voice so quiet it was almost gentle, and that was exactly what made it terrifying. Find her. Find Claire. Not his enemies, Not his money, not the empire that had been waiting 5 years for him to return. Her. And nobody who heard those 4 words that morning understood yet just how much danger one ordinary woman was about to be in. Before we go any further, if you are watching this right now, drop a comment and tell me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because this story is going to take you somewhere you are not prepared for. Stay with me until the very end. You will not regret it. I have been called many things in my life: dangerous, ruthless, cold, a ghost, a machine, a name that people whispered instead of saying out loud because they believed the sound of it alone could summon something dark. My name is Adrienne Moretti, and for 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days, I lived inside a 6x8 cell in a federal correctional facility outside of Detroit. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not asking for your sympathy. I am not telling you I was an innocent man. I did things in my life that I cannot undo. I built something powerful, and I built it with hands that were not always clean. I knew the rules of the world I lived in, and I accepted the consequences of that world. But this story is not about what I did before prison. This story is about what happened to me inside it, and it begins with a letter. I had been locked up for almost 7 months when the first one arrived. 7 months of silence. 7 months of learning that when you are powerful on the outside, you become a target on the inside. Every man in that facility either wanted to prove something by coming after me or wanted to use me to prove something to someone else. I had no peace. I had no privacy. I had nothing. My lawyer visited once a month. My associates sent coded messages through intermediaries. My enemies sent threats wrapped in pleasantries. None of it felt like human contact. None of it reminded me that I was still a person and not just a name on a case file. Then one morning, a corrections officer slid an envelope under the door of my cell. No return address, handwritten. My name on the front in careful, deliberate letters, like the person writing had taken their time. I almost did not open it. I thought it was another threat, another person trying to get information from me, another angle. There were always angles. But something made me open it anyway, and I read it. It was not long, maybe 2 paragraphs. The handwriting was a little uneven, like the person was nervous, and the words were so simple that for a moment I thought it was a mistake, that it had been delivered to the wrong cell. She wrote, "I don't know if you'll read this. I don't know if anyone reads these, but I saw your name in the paper last week, and something made me want to write to you. Not about the trial, not about any of that. I just thought, does anyone write to you? Does anyone ask how you are? I hope someone does. If they don't, I'm asking, how are you?" That was it. No demands, no agenda, no information she was fishing for. Just a question. How are you? I read it 4 times. Then I put it face down on my cot and stared at the ceiling for a long time. I told myself it was a trick. It had to be a trick. In my world, kindness without a motive was not something that existed. You gave something to get something. That was the law that governed everything I had ever known. But I kept coming back to those words. Does anyone ask how you are? And I realized I did not have an answer, because no one had asked me that in months, maybe longer than months. I did not write back immediately. I sat on that letter for 2 weeks. I watched it from across my cell like it might do something, like it was an object I did not know how to handle. Finally, I picked up a pen. I wrote, "I got your letter. I don't know why you sent it. I don't know what you want, but since you asked, I'm surviving. That's all I can say right now. That's what prison is. Surviving." I handed it to the mail officer, and I forgot about it. 3 weeks later, another envelope came. Same handwriting, same careful letters on the front, and inside she had written back. She wrote, "Surviving is enough. I'm glad you're doing that. I thought about what to say to you for a long time. I thought maybe I should pretend I had some brilliant reason for writing, but I don't. The honest reason is that I read about your case and I thought the newspaper articles made you sound like you weren't a person anymore, like you were just a thing that happened. And I didn't like that. People are still people even when they make terrible choices. So I'm Claire. I work at a community college. I like bad coffee and good books. And I'm a terrible cook, which my neighbors can confirm because I've set off the smoke alarm 6 times this year. Tell me something real about yourself. Not the Adrienne from the newspapers. The other one." I sat on my cot and I read that letter 3 times. And then something happened that I could not explain. I laughed. It was a small laugh, barely anything. But it was real. The other one. as if she knew without knowing that there was a version of me the newspapers had never touched. I wrote back that night, longer this time. I told her that before everything else, before the organization and the power and the name that people feared, I had wanted to be an architect. That when I was a boy in my grandmother's house in South Brooklyn, I used to draw buildings. Complicated, impossible buildings with towers that reached clouds and bridges that connected things that were never supposed to connect. I told her I was terrible at math, and that dream died fast. I sealed that letter and handed it in, and then I waited. I told myself I was not waiting. I told myself I had other things to think about. I had legal matters and communication channels and security concerns that required my attention inside those walls. But every Tuesday when mail was distributed, I noticed when the officer walked past my cell. 3 weeks went by. She had written, "An architect." I did not see that coming. I think about that a lot, actually, the people we almost were. The versions of us that got interrupted. I almost studied music, piano. My mother thought it was impractical, and I let her talk me out of it. I still have the piano in my apartment. I play it at night sometimes when I think nobody can hear, but I laughed again, Mrs. Hennessy in 4B. She was talking to me like I was a neighbor, like I was just a man she was writing to because she had things to say, and I was someone worth saying them to. Not a cautionary tale, not a headline, not a symbol of anything, just a man. I wrote back within 2 days. I told her about the sounds in prison. Not the violent sounds, though those existed, but the small sounds. The sound a book made when the spine cracked on a cold morning. The particular quality of silence at 3 in the morning when the whole facility was asleep, and for 20 minutes you could almost forget where you were. I told her that what I missed most about freedom was not grand things. I missed choosing what to eat. I missed cold water from a faucet. She wrote back, "Rain, yes, absolutely rain. I walked home in it last Thursday, and I know most people would say that was terrible, but I stood in it for almost 5 minutes just because I could, because no one was going to tell me I couldn't. I'm going to think about that differently now." That was the first time she said something that made me feel like my words had landed somewhere, like I had reached through the wall between us and touched something real on the other side. Every 2 to 3 weeks, a new envelope, and over time they got longer, they got deeper. She stopped asking careful questions and started saying real things. She told me about her father who had made choices she did not understand and left her cleaning up messes she had not created. She told me about her students at the community college, the ones who came in already defeated, who needed someone to tell them they were worth the trouble of believing in. I wrote, "You are not someone who needs to earn the right to take up space in the world. I have known people who had everything and deserved nothing. You have done more good for a stranger in a prison cell in 7 months of letters than most people do with entire lifetimes of opportunity. You are not someone who should be afraid of being invisible. You are already the most real person I have spoken to in years." I sealed that letter before I could take any of it back. The letters kept coming, month after month, season after season. Inside that cell, I began to understand something I could not have articulated before. The letters were not just communication. They were the only space where I existed as myself. Everything else about my time in that prison was about survival, about managing perception, about never showing weakness because weakness in that world was an invitation for violence. But in those letters, I was not managing anything. I was just Adrian. Not the Adrian who built something feared. Not the Adrian whose name made men lower their voices. Not even the Adrian who had done terrible things to terrible people in a world where the line between necessary and wrong was something everyone crossed without looking down. I was the boy who wanted to be an architect, the man who missed rain, the person who had never in his adult life told anyone that he was afraid, and who found himself writing it plainly to a woman he had never seen in a city he had never been to. I told her once, "I am afraid that when I leave here, I will walk back into the same man I was before, that the person I've become in these letters won't survive contact with the real world." She took 3 weeks to respond to that one. And when she did, she wrote, "I don't think the person you are in these letters is different from who you really are. I think he was always there. I think prison just took away all the other noise." I had to put that letter in the back of my legal folder because if I kept it where I could see it, I would read it every day and I needed to function. So things went on like that for 2 years. 2 years of letters. 2 years of genuine human contact through ink and paper across hundreds of miles. 2 years of waking up on Tuesday morning and feeling something I had no framework for in my previous life. Anticipation. Not the cold, calculating kind I felt before a business meeting or a negotiation. The warm kind. The kind that makes you want time to move faster because something good is coming. I knew her favorite book was a novel about a lighthouse keeper's daughter that she had read 7 times and said got better with each reading. I knew she could not cook but made excellent tea, and that this was a point of pride for her. I knew she had a small scar above her left eyebrow from a bicycle accident when she was 9, and that she thought it made her face interesting rather than flawed. I knew she cried during news stories about animals. I knew her. Not her face, not her voice, not the way she moved through a room, but I knew her. And then 3 months before my release date, the letters stopped. The first week I told myself it was the mail system. Delays happened. Packages got lost. It was nothing. The second week I told myself she was busy. She had a life. She had students and her father's problems and Mrs. Hennessy and 4B. She was a real person with real demands on her time. This was fine. I had been in federal prison for 5 years when she stopped writing. I had dealt with violence and isolation and the particular cruelty that institutions specialize in. I had been threatened, tested, and pushed in ways that most people would not survive with their identity intact. None of that broke me. The silence broke something, not me, but something in me. The third week I stopped telling myself stories, and I just waited. By the 5th week I wrote to her. I kept it simple. I kept it steady. I wrote, I haven't heard from you. I hope you're all right. You don't owe me anything. But I want you to know the door is open if you want to walk back through it. I waited. Nothing. 6th week, 7th week, 8th week, nothing. I am going to be honest with you about what those weeks felt like, because I think it is important that you understand it, because I realized what had been happening in those letters. I had been holding on to something without knowing I was holding it. The proof in ink on paper arriving every 2 to 3 weeks that I was still worth knowing. That somewhere in the world there was a person who chose to know me, not because they wanted something from me, and not because they feared me, and not because I controlled something they needed, just because she wanted to. When that stopped, the silence was not just absence. It was the loudest thing I had ever heard. My release date came. I remember standing at the gate with the brown paper bag they give you, the clothes I had arrived in, some paperwork, my watch, which they had kept for 5 years, and returned to me with the leather strap cracked from age. Marco was waiting, my most loyal man, the one who had kept things running in my absence, the one I trusted more than anyone else in the organization. He looked at me like he was waiting for instructions, like a general waiting for the first order that would start the campaign. I looked at him for a long time, and then I said, I need you to find someone. He said, tell me the name. I said, Claire Morgan. She lives in Chicago. Or she did. She was a counselor at a community college. She wrote to me here for 2 years, and then she disappeared. I need to know where she is, and I need to know that she's safe. Marco stared at me. He had been prepared for many things. He had strategies and contingencies and a list of problems that needed addressing. Enemies who needed to be dealt with. Money that needed to be reclaimed. Territory that had shifted in my absence and needed to be reestablished. He was not prepared for this. He said, Adrian, we have things that... I said, I heard you. Find her first. He understood then what kind of conversation this was. The kind where the answer to everything else was yes. He said, I'll have something in 48 hours. I said 24. And I walked to the car, because here is the thing about being the kind of man I had been before prison. When you spend 5 years learning that power means nothing, if you are alone with it, you come out the other side with a very specific kind of clarity. The empire could wait. She could not. I spent that night in the apartment Marco had prepared. Clean, quiet, nothing like the places I used to keep. I did not want excess. I did not want the symbols of power I had once surrounded myself with to remind me of who I was supposed to be. I sat at the window, and I looked at the city, and I thought about the last letter she ever sent me. She had written about a Tuesday morning when she walked to work in the early fall, and noticed that the leaves on one particular tree on her block had turned completely gold overnight. She said she stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, and people walked around her like she was a rock in a stream, and she just looked at the tree for a full minute because she felt like she needed to give it that, like someone should acknowledge it properly. She wrote, I thought about you when I did that. I thought I hope wherever you are something finds you that's worth stopping for. I had read that letter 10 times on the day it arrived, and then nothing came after it. I needed to understand why. 22 hours after I walked out of prison, Marco called. He said, "I found her." I said, "Is she safe?" A pause, longer than I liked. He said, "She's safe. But Adrian, there's more here than you know. There are things connected to her family that connect back to us. Things that were deliberately buried. You need to hear all of it before you decide what to do." I said, "Tell me on the way." He said, "On the way where?" I said, "Chicago." Another pause. He said, "You're going yourself." It was not a question, but I answered it anyway. I said, "She knew me before she knew my name. She deserves to hear from me directly." Marco said nothing for 3 seconds. Then he said, "I'll arrange the car." I said, "No, just the information." "And Marco." I stopped. I looked out the window at the city I had come back to, the city that was waiting for me to return to form. Whatever you find about her family, whatever debt or connection or problem exists, I want to know the shape of it before I walk in. But I'm not walking in as what I was before. He said, "Then what are you walking in as?" I thought about a woman who stopped on a sidewalk to acknowledge a gold tree because she felt like someone should. I said, "Someone worth knowing." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'll have the file ready in 2 hours." I put the phone down and looked at my cracked leather watch band, and I thought 24 years I spent becoming a man that the world feared, and the only thing I wanted to be now was the man one woman had written to. The question was whether that man still existed, or whether the silence had already answered that. I was about to find out. Part 2. The mafia boss finds the woman behind the letters. The file Marco sent was 43 pages long. Adrian read every single one of them on the drive to Chicago. He did not read fast. He read the way he used to read contracts, slowly, carefully, the way you read something when you know that a single misunderstood word could cost you everything. He went through the pages twice. Then he closed the folder, set it on the seat beside him, and looked out the window at the highway moving past. Marco's voice came through the phone. "You've gone quiet. That's never good." "I'm thinking," Adrian said. "What are you thinking about?" Marco exhaled. "Her father's name is Gerald Morgan, 61 years old, former accountant. He got involved with some people about 6 years ago, not our people directly, but people adjacent to us. People in the network who operated around the edges of what we controlled. He got in deep, gambling first, then borrowing to cover the gambling, then borrowing from the wrong people to cover what he borrowed from the first people. By the time anyone who mattered noticed, 3 million, Adrian said. He said it flat, not as a reaction, as a fact. He never had it. He never could have paid it. So the people he owed started looking at what else he had. And what he had, what nobody knew he had, was access. His daughter worked at a community college. She ran a volunteer program. One of the things that program did was connect community members to incarcerated individuals through correspondence. Adrian was very still. "That's how she found you," Marco said. "The program. She was the one who ran it. She pulled case files. She read through them. She chose you specifically." Adrian said, "Why me?" "That," Marco said, "is the part I'm still working on. She chose your case, and she wrote the first letter herself rather than assigning it to a volunteer. That's a deviation from how the program worked, which means she made a deliberate choice." Adrian looked at the folder on the seat beside him. He thought about the first letter, the 2 paragraphs, the uneven handwriting, the nervous quality of the words like someone who had been thinking about doing something for a long time and finally decided to just do it. "Does anyone ask how you are?" He had assumed that was innocence. He had assumed she was simply kind. "The people her father owed," Adrian said. "Who are we talking about specifically?" "Carmine Ressa," Marco said. The car was quiet for a long moment. "Ressa," Adrian said. "Yes." Carmine Ressa was not a name Adrian said out loud casually. Ressa was not someone who existed in the visible part of the world Adrian had operated in. He existed underneath it, in the infrastructure. The man who moved money and information and favors between people who could never be seen interacting with each other directly. A fixer in the most dangerous and complete sense of the word. "Gerald Morgan didn't just owe Ressa money," Marco said. "While he was trying to figure out how to get out from under the debt, he stumbled onto something. He was doing some bookkeeping work unofficial off the books for a property management company that Ressa used to move money. And somewhere in those books, Gerald Morgan found a thread. He pulled it. Maybe he was trying to find leverage. Maybe he was just desperate and scared. But what he found was documentation." Adrian closed his eyes. "The case that convicted me," he said. "Yes." "Ressa had people inside," Adrian said. "It gets worse," Marco said. When Gerald Morgan realized what he had found, when he understood what he was looking at, he panicked. He didn't know who to go to. He didn't know who to trust. So he kept it. He sat on it. And in the meantime, Claire was writing to you. 2 years of letters. And at some point, someone in Ressa's network started paying attention to those letters. "They were being monitored," Adrian said. "The mail coming in and out of the facility was being flagged by one of the corrupted officials. When your conviction was being appealed and it started looking like you might actually get out, Ressa's people got nervous. They knew Gerald Morgan had the documentation. They knew Claire was your only outside contact. They put the pieces together and they decided Claire was a liability." Adrian said, "They told her to stop writing. I thought about week 5, week 6, week 7. The letter he had written that she never answered. He thought about the specific quality of that silence and how he had lived inside it for months before his release, not knowing what it was made of. It was made of fear. She had not abandoned him. She had been protecting him. She had walked away from 2 years of letters, from the only real connection he had to himself during those years, because someone had told her that her father's life depended on her silence. And she had done it without explanation, because she understood that an explanation would be more dangerous than nothing. She had protected him by disappearing from him, and he had spent months wondering if she had simply lost interest. "Adrian," Marco said carefully, "what are you going to do?" Adrian picked up the folder. He put it back in his lap. He looked at the top page, which had Claire Morgan's address on it, handwritten in Marco's controlled printing. "I'm going to go talk to her," he said. And then I'm going to figure out what Ressa has done," Adrian said, "and I'm going to take it apart." Marco said, "That is not going to be a simple—" "I know," Adrian said. "I don't want simple. I want done. I want the thing that was built to destroy me taken apart piece by piece until there is nothing left of it. And I want Claire Morgan to be safe when that happens." He paused. She ran a program connecting people to prisoners because she thought the world wasn't paying enough attention to the human beings inside those facilities. She spent 2 years writing to a man the entire world had decided was not worth knowing. Marco was quiet. Then he said, "You've changed." Adrian looked at the highway. "I know," he said. "I'm not entirely sure what I've changed into yet, but I'm working on it." He arrived in Chicago on a Tuesday morning. He thought about that later, the day of the week. Tuesday was always the day mail was distributed in the facility. Tuesday was the day he used to feel that specific kind of anticipation. It felt like the kind of coincidence that was not entirely a coincidence. I had Marco's man drive him to the neighborhood where Claire lived, not to her building. He wanted to walk the last part. He wanted to feel the geography of the place she had described to him in letters. The coffee shop on the corner that she said made terrible coffee, but she kept going back to because the woman behind the counter remembered her order. The small park 2 blocks east where she sometimes sat on her lunch break. "More than told her," Marco said. "They threatened her father. They made it very clear what would happen to Gerald Morgan and to her if she continued any contact with you. They told her that if she stopped quietly and disappeared from your life, the debt would be restructured. Her father would be given time, as long as she walked away and never explained why." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight. Adrian sat in it for a long time. He walked through it. It was an ordinary neighborhood, nothing remarkable, exactly the kind of place that would never appear in a newspaper or in a story about power or influence. And yet it was the most specific geography he had ever known because he had learned it through her words. He found her building, 6 floors, brick exterior, a small awning over the entrance that had seen better decades. He stood outside it for a moment, then he went in. He had known her for 2 years through ink and paper, and he had built a version of her in his mind that was constructed entirely from words, from the careful way she structured her sentences, from the things she chose to mention and the things she chose to leave out, from the rhythm of her handwriting on pages he had read until the paper went soft at the folds. But her voice was something different. "I know because I looked," he said. "And I looked because you stopped writing and nobody told me why. I spent 3 months in prison after you went silent wondering what happened to you. And then I spent 2 years going over every letter you ever sent me, trying to find the thing I missed that should have told me something was wrong." He stopped, steadied himself. "I'm not here to frighten you. I'm not here because I'm angry with you." Another long silence. Then, information about what? About why you stopped writing, he said. About your father. About the people who told you to disappear. He paused. About the fact that I know what they said to you, and I need you to understand that none of it was your fault. He heard her breath catch through the speaker, a small sound, but unmistakable. Then the door buzzed open. She was standing in the doorway of her apartment on the 4th floor when he came off the elevator. He recognized her from the photographs Marco had found a community college staff directory, a group photo from a volunteer event. But photographs were a flat thing. They showed you the surface of a person without giving you any of the information that mattered. What the photographs had not shown him was the way she stood, straight-backed arms crossed over her chest, chin slightly lifted. The posture of someone who was afraid but had made a decision not to show it. Someone who had learned a long time ago that showing fear made you smaller. He recognized that posture. He had lived in a version of it for 5 years. He stopped a few feet away from her. "In my mind," he said from the letters, "I had a picture of you, shorter. I don't know why, something about the way you wrote." He stopped himself. He was rambling. He did not ramble. He had spent 30 years never rambling, and apparently 2 minutes in front of this woman was undoing that completely. She stared at him. Then, despite everything, despite the fear that was clearly moving through her, she said, "You imagined what I looked like. Didn't you?" he said. A beat. "Then you were taller too." Something shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. She stepped back and opened the door wider. "Come in," she said. "But I want you to know that my neighbor across the hall is home, and she has my phone number, and she will call someone if I text her a specific word." "Good," he said. "That's smart. You should have a system like that." She looked at him like she didn't know what to do with that response. He went in. The apartment was exactly what the letters had described, without ever explicitly describing. Small, cluttered in a specific way that suggested a person with too many books and not enough shelves. There was a piano against one wall that he noticed immediately, and there was a plant on the windowsill that was talking to him, metaphorically speaking, because it was slightly too big for its pot, and had clearly been there long enough to have opinions about its situation. He did not say any of that. He sat where she indicated, and he waited. She sat across from him. Her hands were in her lap, and she was watching him with the focused attention of someone who was taking in every detail and processing it very fast. She said, "How much do you know?" He said, "Enough. Your father's debt. Carmine Ressa. The people who monitored our letters. The ultimatum they gave you." She closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, something had changed in her expression. Not relief. Not quite. Something more complicated. She said, "They said if I stopped and said nothing, if I just disappeared from your life, that my father would be given more time. That they wouldn't hurt him." She stopped. "I know how that sounds. I know you probably think, I think you did what you had to do to protect someone you loved," Adrian said. She looked at him. "I'm not angry with you," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. I spent a long time in that facility thinking I had misread something, thinking maybe the connection I felt through those letters was something I had built up in my own mind because I was desperate and isolated and needed it to be real." He stopped. "But that's not what it was it?" It was not a question. She shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "That's not what it was." "Then tell me why," he said. "Not the threat. I know the threat. Tell me why you chose me in the first place. You ran a program. You had volunteers. You could have assigned my case to someone else, but you wrote the first letter yourself." He looked at her steadily. "Why me, specifically?" She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her hands. Then she said, "I read the case files as part of the program. We were always looking for people who had no correspondence, no family contact, no outside support system, because those tend to be the people who have the hardest time." She stopped. "Your file said you had received no mail in 7 months, no visits, nothing. You were completely isolated." She looked up. "And then I read the newspaper coverage, and every single article talked about you like you were already gone. My father used to say that the most dangerous thing you can do to a person," she said, "is convince them they don't exist anymore, that they're not real, that they don't count." Her voice was very quiet now. "He used to say that before he became someone I didn't recognize anymore, back when he still said things that were worth keeping." She looked at Adrian. "I read your file and I thought this man has been erased, and I don't know if he deserves to be or not. I chose you, she said, because I thought the least I could do was remind you that you were still a person. And then she stopped, and something complicated moved across her face. And then 2 years went by, and it turned out you were actually a real person, which sounds stupid when I say it out loud, but I don't know how else to say it. You were more real than most people I know in my actual life, and that, she stopped again. Frightened you, he said. Terrified me, she said. He nodded. Me too, he said. She blinked. You think it was comfortable, he said. Sitting in a prison cell, learning that the most honest conversations I'd had in a decade were happening through handwritten letters with a woman I'd never met. You think that didn't keep me up at night? He shook his head. You don't just talk to someone like that for 2 years and walk away unaffected. Except one of us did walk away. It was quieter than he expected. Careful, with an edge of wariness underneath it that told him she was someone who had learned to be cautious about unexpected things. He said, My name is Adrian Moretti. I think you know who I am. The silence that followed was so complete he could almost feel it through the speaker. Then, how did you find me? I'm good at finding things, he said. Can I come up? No, she said immediately. No, how did you get this address? How do you know? Something landed in his chest with a weight that surprised him. He said, a drawer. A whole drawer, she said. Then quietly, almost to herself, I kept thinking about what you wrote once, about the sounds in prison at 3 a.m, and I thought about you in that cell and the silence, and She stopped, pressed her lips together. I hated myself for not being able to explain. I hated that you were probably sitting there thinking I had just given up. I hated that I couldn't. Hey, he said, gently. I know now. That's what matters. She looked at him. Her eyes were bright. Then something shifted in her expression. The warmth that had briefly opened between them began to close, and he saw her pulling back, restructuring herself, remembering what she had been told to remember about the man sitting across from her. She said, Adrian. He said, yes. She said, you walked out of prison 2 days ago. You had an entire organization waiting for you, people who needed things from you, a whole world that had been on hold for 5 years. She looked at him carefully. And the first thing you did was come here, to find me. Yes, he said. Why? She said. I mean truly, why you had your answer. You found out the truth through whatever means you used to find me. You know I didn't leave voluntarily. You know what Ressa did. So why come in person? Why come yourself? He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, because in 2 years of letters I told you things I have never said to another living person. And you did the same. And whatever the world outside this room thinks those things make me, I am not someone who walks away from that without looking it in the eye. She held his gaze. It's the only honest one I have right now, he said. I know what Ressa did. I know why he did it. I know that what your father found is the thread that could unravel the thing that was built to put me away. And I know that if I pull that thread the right way, it doesn't just clear your father's debt, it exposes everything. He leaned forward slightly. But doing that means going to war with people who have spent years building defenses against exactly that kind of exposure. Adrian was very still. He had run organizations. He had sat across from federal prosecutors and said nothing that could be used against him. He had been in rooms with dangerous men and never once shown any of them what was happening inside him. He was not entirely sure what his face was doing right now. He said, you chose me because you recognized something. A choice, he said, for you. Not one I'm giving you, one that was created by circumstances before either of us had a say in it. Your father's debt is real. The documentation he found is real. The people who've been using both of those things to keep you quiet and keep me isolated are real. He paused. I can make the debt disappear, but if I do that by the means I have available to me, it puts you in my world, inside it, where I can make sure you're protected, where you can what, she said. Where I can know you're safe. He said simply, not as a prisoner, not as an obligation, as, he stopped. He looked for the word and found it. As the person you already are to me, which is the person who kept me human for 2 years when everything else in that place was trying to make me into something else. The silence that followed was the longest one since he had sat down. She said, I need you to understand something. Tell me, he said. I wrote to you because I thought you needed someone to remind you that you were a person, she said. But I also wrote to you because I needed something too, something I didn't know how to name. I was living this life where I spent all my energy holding other people up and none of it on myself. And somehow writing to you was the one place where I was, I don't know, where I wasn't performing being okay, where I could just say things. She stopped. I don't know what any of this means. She flinched, and he saw it, and he said immediately, That wasn't an accusation. I already told you why you left. I'm saying... He stopped and gathered something, and then said it plainly. I'm saying that you were not the only one who was changed by those letters. The apartment was very quiet. She said after a long moment, I thought about you every day after I stopped writing. Every single day. I kept starting letters I couldn't send. I have a drawer full of them. I don't know what you want from me, or what I have to offer someone like you, or what any version of this even looks like. But I know that I have a drawer full of unsent letters to you. And I know that the day I stopped writing was one of the worst days I've had in a long time. And I don't want to be someone who pretends that's not true just because the situation is complicated. Yee! Adrian looked at her for a long time. Then he said, It's very complicated. She let out a short, unexpected breath, almost a laugh. Yes. I've been in prison for 5 years, he said. I have enemies who are going to test whether I'm still what I was. I have an organization that needs to be managed. I have a war to run against people who corrupted the system that convicted me. I am by any reasonable measure a completely terrible option for anyone who wants a simple life. I don't have a simple life, she said. No, he said. You don't. You have a father with a $3 million debt to a dangerous man and a drawer full of letters to a convicted criminal who just showed up at your apartment. She almost smiled. Almost. He said, But here's what I can promise you. I'm going to take care of Ressa. I'm going to make sure your father's debt is resolved and that nobody uses it as leverage against you again. And I'm going to do it in a way that doesn't require you to give up anything you don't choose to give up. He paused. After that, what happens next is your decision, not mine. Then she said, I'll tell you what my father found, where the documents are, everything. She straightened slightly in her chair. Not because I owe you, but because Ressa doesn't get to win. No, Adrian said. He doesn't. She nodded once, decided. Then she said, I'm going to make tea, because that's the only thing I'm actually good at in a kitchen. And then you're going to tell me what your plan is, and I'm going to tell you what I know, and we're going to figure out how bad this actually is. She stood up, looked down at him. Are you okay with that? He said yes. She turned toward the kitchen. Then she stopped, turned back. She said, For what it's worth, the letters weren't a mistake. Whatever else happened, I want you to know that. He said, I know. She said, Good. And she went to make the tea. Adrian sat in the quiet apartment with the too big plant on the windowsill and the piano against the wall and the drawer, somewhere in this space filled with letters she had written and never sent, and he felt something settle in him, something he had not felt in a very long time. Adrian knew that the moment he moved against Ressa, the response would be swift, and it would not be careful. That meant Claire needed to be somewhere safe before he moved at all. That meant he had days, maybe less. The tea appeared on the coffee table in front of him. She sat back down across from him. Her hands were steadier now. There was something different in her posture, less bracing, more ready. She said, Okay, tell me what you know. He told her. And as he did, watching her face process the layers of it, the corruption, the manipulation, the years of careful architecture that had been built to keep him caged, and her silent, he saw something he recognized from 2 years of letters. She was not afraid of the truth. She never had been. She said at one point quietly, almost to herself, They used my kindness as a weapon. He said, Yes. They let me write to you for 2 years, she said, and then they used the fact that I cared what happened to you as the thing that made me stop. Yes, he said. She was quiet. Then she said, and there was something in her voice that was neither soft nor loud, but very clear. I want to be there when it ends. He looked at her. Ressa, she said, whatever you're going to do, whatever the end of this looks like, I want to be there for it. She looked at him steadily. They used my voice to hurt you. I want to use it to do the opposite. Adrian looked at the woman across the table from him. He thought about the letter that had started all of this. 2 paragraphs, uneven handwriting, a question so simple it cut straight through everything he had built around himself. Does anyone ask how you are? Then she said very quietly, The people who threatened my father, They didn't just go away because I stopped writing. They're still there. They're still holding the debt. My father still owes them. And now that you're out—" She stopped and he could see the calculation running behind her eyes. "Now that you're out, I don't know what they're going to do next." "I know," he said. "What are you going to do about it?" she said. "Everything," he said. She stared at him. "That's not an answer." It took almost 2 hours, not because the story was complicated to tell, but because she had been carrying it alone for so long that the words kept catching somewhere between her chest and her mouth, like they had forgotten the route out. Adrian did not rush her. He sat with the same stillness he had learned in prison, the kind that was not passive but active, the kind that said, "I am here, I am listening, nothing you say is going to make me leave." When she was done, he sat forward. "I thought she is either the bravest person I have ever met, or she has no idea what she is walking into." Then he thought probably both. He said, "Finish your tea first." She looked at him. Then she picked up her cup. He picked up his. And that was where the real thing between them began. Not in a letter, not in a prison, not in the careful distance of ink and paper across hundreds of miles. "I thought this is what it feels like when the thing you've been holding on to turns out to be real." And then he thought, now comes the hard part. Because Carmine Ressa was not a man who accepted being exposed quietly. He was not a man who let go of leverage without a fight. The documents Gerald Morgan had found were dangerous precisely because they were real, and real evidence in the wrong hands had a way of making people desperate enough to do terrible things. He said, "Where are the documents now?" She said, "My father has them. Or he did. He keeps them in a safety deposit box at a bank in Pilsen. He's been terrified to move them and terrified to destroy them because he thinks they're the only thing keeping him alive." "He's right," Adrian said. "They are." She looked at him. "Does that mean Ressa knows he has them?" "Ressa suspects," Adrian said. "He doesn't know exactly what Gerald found or how much of it survived. That's why he kept the debt alive instead of just making the problem disappear. As long as your father is alive and still paying or trying to pay, Ressa controls the situation without having to escalate it. The moment that balance shifts, your father becomes a loose end." She went very still. "And now that you're out—" "The balance has already shifted," Adrian said. She stood up. She walked to the window. Her back was to him, and he could see the tension in her shoulders, the particular set of them that said she was working through something quickly and needed a moment to do it without her face giving her away. He had never seen her face before 2 hours ago, but he already knew how to read it. She turned back around. "We have to get to my father before Ressa realizes you're here." "How fast can you reach him?" "Dad," she said, and Adrian heard the way her voice changed. Not softer exactly, more careful, the voice of someone who had learned to speak to a person in a way that didn't alarm them while still conveying urgency underneath. "Are you home? Are you alone?" A pause. "I need you to stay there. Don't open the door for anyone. I'm coming to you. It's important." Another pause. Longer. He could hear a voice on the other end, tinny and uncertain. "Dad, I know." She hung up. She looked at Adrian. He said, "I'm coming with you." She said, "He's going to be terrified of you." "I know," he said, "but I'm coming anyway, because if Ressa's people are already moving, you can't walk into that apartment alone." She looked at him for one long second. Then she grabbed her coat. They took Adrian's car. He drove. She sat in the passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her phone face up on her knee, watching it like it might ring with news she wasn't ready for. 12 minutes into the drive it did. Not her father's number, a number she didn't recognize. She looked at it, looked at Adrian. He said, "Answer it." She did. She put it on speaker. The voice on the other end was smooth, measured. The voice of someone who had spent a long time practicing how to sound unhurried. "Miss Morgan," the voice said, "I think it's time we spoke directly. I've been patient with our current arrangement, but I'm afraid circumstances have changed." Claire said nothing. Her jaw was tight. Adrian said, "Ressa." A pause on the line, very brief. Then, "Mr. Moretti, I wondered how long before you surfaced. I have to say I expected a bit more theater from you. Showing up in Chicago yourself, very old-fashioned." "I've always preferred doing things personally," Adrian said, "as you know." "Indeed," Ressa said. "Then let me be personal as well. The young woman beside you has been very cooperative up until now. I would hate for that to change. And her father—" Another pause, deliberately waited. "Her father has been keeping something for us. I think it's time he returned it." Claire said, "Don't." Her voice was quiet, but it stopped everything. She said, "Don't threaten my father." Ressa said, "Miss Morgan." "We have the documents," Adrian said. "All of them. Not just what Gerald Morgan found. The thread he pulled, we followed it all the way back. We know about the payments to the corrections officials. We know about the testimony that was shaped before it was given. We know about the money that moved through the property management company 6 weeks before my trial. All of it." He paused. "And in 18 hours if I don't make a specific phone call." "No," she said. And there was something in her voice that Adrian had not heard before. Not anger exactly. Something beyond anger. Something that had been compressed for a very long time and had finally found the pressure point where it broke through. "You used me. You let me spend 2 years doing something real, something that actually mattered, and then you took it from me as a weapon. You used my kindness to hurt someone." Copies of everything. Go to 3 federal prosecutors, 2 investigative journalists, and 1 particular senator on the Oversight Committee who has been looking for a reason to open an inquiry into exactly this kind of corruption for 2 years. "I do," he said. "I'm not here to control anything. I've spent my entire adult life trying to control things, and I walked out of a federal prison with nothing but a cracked watch strap and a pile of memories to show for it. I'm done choosing power over people." She looked at him, long, the way she had probably looked at everything that mattered to her in her life, quietly, carefully, like she was reading something and wanted to make sure she understood every word before she turned the page. He said it evenly, like he was describing weather. The silence that followed was the kind that meant something had shifted. Ressa said, "You don't have 18 hours worth of leverage." "Try me," Adrian said. The line went dead. Adrian put the phone down. Claire was staring at him. She said, "Do we actually have all of that?" He said, "We will in about 4 hours." She stared at him. "You said 18 hours. "Since my conviction was first appealed," he said. "I knew Ressa was involved. I didn't know the mechanism. Your father's documentation gives us the mechanism." He glanced at her briefly. "We just need to get to him before Ressa recalculates." She said, "Drive faster." He drove faster. "I needed a number that sounded like I'd already thought everything through," he said. 14 hours of margin." She exhaled. "Adrian." "It's going to be fine," he said. "Marco has been working on this since before we left your apartment. The documentation your father found is the cornerstone, but it's not the only piece. My legal team has been building the rest for 2 years." She said, 2 years. Gerald Morgan's apartment building was a 4-story walk-up in Pilsen, a neighborhood that had been changing for a decade, and showed it in the way the old buildings sat next to the new ones, like they weren't sure they belonged to the same story anymore. Adrian pulled up outside. Claire was out of the car before it fully stopped. She hit the call button for her father's unit. No answer. She hit it again and again. Adrian was beside her. He said quietly, "Which floor?" A man in a gray jacket who was built the way people who are paid to be built look large, deliberate, like every part of him served a purpose. He took up most of the doorframe. He looked at Claire and then at Adrian, and he said, "Miss Morgan, Mr. Moretti would like you to both come upstairs. Mr. Morgan is expecting you." Claire said, "Where is my father? Is he hurt?" The man said, "He's fine. He's upstairs. Please." Adrian put his hand on Claire's arm. She looked at him. He said very quietly, "It's a conversation. Ressa is smart enough to know that any other move right now makes everything worse for him. He wants to negotiate." He looked at the man in the doorway. "That's right, isn't it? This is a meeting." The man said, "Upstairs, Mr. Moretti." They went up. Gerald Morgan was sitting at his kitchen table. He was a small man, shorter than Claire, with the specific thinness of someone who had been worried for so long that his body had started consuming itself from the inside. His eyes went to Claire the moment she came through the door, and the relief in them was immediate and complete. She crossed to him, took both his hands, said, "Are you hurt?" He shook his head. No, I'm okay. I'm Claire who is..." His eyes went to Adrian and stayed there. His face changed. The specific change of someone who had read a name in enough bad context that the face attached to it carried weight before a word was spoken. He said, "Moretti." Adrian said, "Mr. Morgan." Gerald Morgan looked at his daughter. "You brought him here." She said, "He's on our side, Dad." "He's..." Gerald stopped. He looked between them. He said, "Do you understand who this man is? Do you understand what his name means? Claire, whatever he told you, whatever arrangement he's— Dad, she said firmly, stop. Listen to me. I know what his name means. I know his history. I also know that the people who have been using your debt to control our lives for the last 2 years are the same people who built the case that put him in prison. And if we give him what you found, what you've been keeping, we can end this. Gerald Morgan looked at his daughter, then at Adrian, then back at his daughter. He said, if I give that to him and he uses it wrong, if he uses it to protect himself and leaves us exposed— He won't, Claire said. How do you know that? Gerald said. She said, because I know him. The room was quiet. Gerald Morgan looked at his daughter with the particular expression of a parent who has made enough mistakes that they no longer have the standing to tell their child they're wrong. It was not a comfortable expression to wear. Adrian recognized it as the face of someone living with themselves. Gerald said, You know him from the letters. I know him, she said simply. Gerald looked at Adrian again, held his gaze for a long moment. Then he said, There's a safety deposit box at First Midwest Bank on Cermak. Box 447. The key is in my bureau drawer under a blue envelope. He paused. There are 4 manila folders. Everything is inside. Copies, originals, everything. Adrian said, Thank you. Gerald Morgan said, Don't thank me. Just make sure my daughter stays safe. That's the only thing I'm asking. Whatever happens to me, whatever happens with the debt, just make sure she doesn't get hurt. Adrian said, That's the one thing I can guarantee you. Gerald looked at him for one more moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who had run out of better options and knew it. Then the man in the gray jacket stepped through from the hallway. He said, Mr. Ressa would like a word. Adrian said, I assumed he would. The man held out a phone. Adrian took it. He held it for a moment, looking at it the way you look at something before you decide what it means. Then he raised it to his ear. Ressa's voice came through immediately. Now that the pleasantries are concluded, he said, Let's talk about what actually happens from here. Adrian said, You go first. Gracious, Ressa said. All right, here is what I know. You have documentation that is dangerous to me. I have resources and reach that are dangerous to you. The girl and her father sit in the middle of this, which is a position neither of them asked for, and neither of them can sustain. A pause. I am going to make you an offer. You return what Gerald Morgan found. I release the debt completely. The Morgan family is untouched. And the corrections officials, Adrian said. The testimony that was shaped before it was given my 5 years, Ressa said. Some debts don't get repaid, you know that. Some do, Adrian said. That's the difference between you and me. Ressa said, You're being sentimental. You negotiate your own terms instead of having them dictated to you. Another pause. The one thing that is not on the table is the Morgan family. They are done being used as leverage. That ends today regardless of what you decide. Yee. The silence from Ressa's end was longer this time. Adrian waited. Ressa said, I need time. You have until tomorrow morning, Adrian said. 8 o'clock. After that, I make the phone call I described and the process takes over. He handed the phone back to the man in the gray jacket. The man left. Gerald Morgan was staring at Adrian. Did that just— He stopped. Did you just offer Ressa a way out? I offered him a way to make this more useful than it would otherwise be, Adrian said. If he testifies the case against the corruption is airtight. If he doesn't, we still have the documentation, but the picture is incomplete. Ressa testifying fills in the parts that documents alone can't prove. He looked at Gerald. And it keeps your daughter safer. Because a man who is cooperating with federal oversight has much less incentive to make problems for anyone. Claire had been standing very still through all of this. He looked at her. She said, You thought all of this through before we got here. He said, On the drive. She said, In 12 minutes. He said, I had a long time in prison to practice thinking fast. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her expression was shifting, rearranging itself around new information. The way a person's face changes when they are understanding something they had only partially understood before. She said, You're not just protecting us, you're actually trying to fix it, the whole thing. He said, I spent 5 years inside something that was broken by people who were supposed to maintain it. The least I can do on the way out is make sure it can't be broken the same way again. Gerald Morgan made a small sound. They both looked at him. The small man at the kitchen table put his hands over his face for a moment. Just a moment. Then he lowered them. He said to Claire, "I'm sorry for all of it. The gambling, the debt, the position I put you in. I'm sorry that you had to—" His voice broke slightly. He steadied it. "I'm sorry that my mess cost you something that mattered to you." Claire said, "Dad." He said, Don't tell me it's okay, just let me say it." She said, "Okay." He said, "I'm sorry." She went to him, sat beside him, put her hand over his. "No," Adrian said. "I'm being accurate." He paused. "Here is my offer. You come in. Not to me, I'm not a federal authority, and this isn't about protecting my ego. You provide testimony to the Oversight Committee about the mechanism, the payments, the officials, the shaped testimony, all of it. In return, I present nothing additional. The documentation speaks for itself. You cooperate, you potentially get something other than a full federal case building against you for the next decade." I thought this is what the letters were about. Not him specifically. Claire had spent her life holding people up, her father, her students, strangers in prison cells. She did it because she understood at the most practical level that people needed to be seen to survive. Not metaphorically, literally, the way plants needed light. And in doing it for everyone else, she had found something unexpected, someone who held her up in return. Marco said, "We have a problem." Adrian said, "What kind?" "The bank," Marco said. "Someone accessed the safety deposit box registry at First Midwest on Cermak 40 minutes ago. They didn't open the box, but they ran the registry. Someone is checking whether the box exists and who it belongs to." Adrian said, "Ressa moved faster than the phone call." "He had someone already in place," Marco said. "He was hedging before he picked up the phone, which means the offer of cooperation was either real and being evaluated simultaneously, or it was theater to buy time while his people moved." Adrian said, "Which do you think?" Marco said, "I think it's both. I think Ressa is genuinely considering the offer because he's smart enough to run the numbers. But I think he's also making sure he has a backup option if the numbers don't work out in his favor." Adrian said, "We need to get the box before he does." Marco said, "I can have people there in 20 minutes. Adrian said, "Send them." And Marco quietly, "This doesn't become a confrontation. This is a retrieval, fast and clean." He went back into the kitchen. "I'm asking you to be the version of yourself that gets to walk out of a room instead of the version that gets carried out of one," Adrian said. "You're smart. You know the mathematics. The documentation exists. My legal team has been building the surrounding case for 2 years. The moment I authorize them to move you are the center of a federal investigation, and everything around you becomes evidence." He paused. "Or you cooperate. You control the narrative." Claire looked at him immediately. She read his face the way she had learned to read his letters, looking for what was underneath the surface words. She said, "What happened?" He said, "Someone checked the registry at the bank. We need to get to the box before they do." He looked at Gerald. "Does anyone else know about that box, anyone at all?" Gerald shook his head, then stopped. His face changed. Adrian said, "What?" Gerald said, "My accountant. He helped me set it up. I didn't tell him what was in it, but he knows the box exists. He knows which bank." "What's his name?" Adrian said. Gerald said, "Frank DeLuca." Adrian said, "And how did Frank DeLuca come to be your accountant?" Gerald Morgan's face went gray. He said, "He was referred to me, about 6 years ago, by one of the men who worked for—" He stopped. "He was referred by someone in Ressa's network. I didn't know that at the time. I just thought—" He stopped. The room was very quiet. Adrian said evenly, "Your accountant has been reporting to Ressa the entire time." Gerald said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Adrian said. "But it means Ressa has known about the box for longer than we thought. He knew it existed. He just didn't know exactly what was in it or whether Gerald had made copies. He had not understood that until now, standing in her father's kitchen, watching her take care of someone who had cost her enormously and loving him anyway. He thought she is not ordinary. She never was. Anyone else know about that box, anyone at all?" Gerald shook his head, then stopped. His face changed. Adrian said, "What?" Gerald said, "My accountant. He helped me set it up. I didn't tell him what was in it, but he knows the box exists. He knows which bank." "What's his name?" Adrian said. Gerald said, "Frank DeLuca." Adrian said, "And how did Frank DeLuca come to be your accountant?" Gerald Morgan's face went gray. He said, "He was referred to me, about 6 years ago, by one of the men who worked for—" He stopped. He was referred by someone in Ressa's network. I didn't know that at the time. I just thought—" He stopped. The room was very quiet. Adrian said evenly, "Your accountant has been reporting to Ressa the entire time." Gerald said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," Adrian said. "But it means Ressa has known about the box for longer than we thought. He knew it existed. He just didn't know exactly what was in it or whether Gerald had made copies. He had not understood that until now, standing in her father's kitchen, watching her take care of someone who had cost her enormously and loving him anyway. He thought she is not ordinary. She never was. She is the kind of person who is so specifically themselves that people who are not paying attention can mistake it for simplicity. He had been paying attention for 2 years. He was still paying attention. His phone buzzed. Marco. He stepped into the hallway. He said, "And if Ressa chooses option 2, if he decides fighting is better than cooperating," Adrian said, "then he spends the next several years in exactly the kind of place he helped put me. And the Morgan family becomes witnesses in a federal case which comes with its own protections." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When Claire started writing to you, I told her it was a bad idea. I told her she was too kind for her own good, that she was going to get hurt." Adrian said, "She did get hurt, because of people you were connected to." Gerald nodded. He did not flinch from it. "Yes," he said, "she did, and I'll carry that." He looked at Adrian. "What I'm trying to say poorly is that I was wrong about what it would cost her. I thought kindness was the liability, but it wasn't. It turned out to be the only thing that—" He stopped, looked between his daughter and Adrian. "Well," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 43 minutes later, Marco called. Adrian answered on the first ring. Marco said, "Box secured, 4 folders exactly as described, originals and copies. Our people got there 8 minutes before Ressa's." He paused. "Adrian, I've looked at the documents." Adrian said, "And—" Marco said, "It's worse than we thought, not better worse. The payments to the corrections officials are documented, but that's not all. There are records in here of communication between Ressa and the lead prosecutor on your case before the trial. Not just shape testimony, active coordination. The prosecution knew the testimony was constructed and used it anyway." Adrian sat down on the edge of the kitchen counter. He said, "The prosecutor." Marco said, "Yes." He said, "Name." Marco said the name. Adrian closed his eyes for 1 second. The prosecutor. The man who had stood in front of a jury and performed outrage at Adrian's conduct. The man who had made speeches about justice and the rule of law and the necessity of holding powerful men accountable. The man who had 3 years after the trial been appointed to a federal judgeship. Adrian said, "A sitting federal judge." Marco said, "Yes." He said, "The documents prove this." Marco said, "Clearly and completely." Adrian looked across the kitchen at Claire. She was watching him. She had been watching him through all of it. Her expression was very still in the way his went still when he was processing something that was larger than he had expected. Adrian said, "You and Claire stay here with someone I trust while my people secure the box. Then we move you both to a different location until this is resolved." Gerald said, "Resolved how?" Adrian said, "By tomorrow morning, Ressa is either cooperating with federal oversight or he is the subject of a federal investigation. Either way, the debt is gone, and you are not someone anyone has a reason to threaten anymore." Gerald looked at him. He said to Marco, "Call our federal contacts, not the committee yet, the contacts. I want to know who handles judicial conduct investigations, and I want them aware. We have something significant before we present it formally." He paused. "And Marco, I need you to send a message to Ressa. Tell him the offer is still open. But tell him the information we have is more than he knew we had. Tell him the decision he makes tonight is the most important one he'll make in the next 20 years. Marco said, "And if he still says no," Adrian said, "then we hand everything to the Oversight Committee, the investigative journalists, and the federal contact simultaneously and let the process move." Marco said, "Understood." He hung up. Claire said, "What was that last part, the part that made you sit down?" He looked at her. He said, "The documents don't just prove what Ressa did. They prove that the prosecutor who built the case against me knew the testimony was false, coordinated with Ressa before the trial." She went very still. He said, "He's a federal judge now." She exhaled. He said, "This is bigger than a debt and a prison sentence. This is a sitting federal judge with documented evidence of prosecutorial misconduct so severe that every case he touched is now in question." She said, "What does that mean for you?" He said, "It means the conviction was not just appealed, it was built on documented fraud. It means everything I lost 5 years of my life to was constructed." He paused. "It means I was right to believe it wasn't clean." She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be." She said, "I am anyway." He looked at her, at the woman who had written to him for 2 years in a prison that was never supposed to hold him honestly, who had protected him by disappearing, who had kept a drawer full of unsent letters because she could not make herself stop talking to him even when she could not send the words. He said, "When this is over, and it will be over, what do you want?" She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I mean, what do you want? Not what do you owe anyone? Not what do you need to do to keep people safe? What does Claire Morgan actually want when the weight of everyone else's problems has been lifted?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I want to finish the conversations we started in those letters. All of them. The ones we never got to because you got out and I got scared." He said, "That's a lot of conversations." She said, 2 years worth. He said, "Then we'll need time." She said, "Yes." He said, "We have it. After tomorrow we have it." She nodded. Once. Then Gerald Morgan cleared his throat from the kitchen table. They both looked at him, the small man with the worried eyes who had started all of this without meaning to. He said, "I don't suppose someone could make coffee. I think I need coffee." Claire looked at her father. Then she looked at Adrian. Then she said, "I'll make tea. The coffee here is terrible." Claire said, "Which is why he kept the debt structured as leverage instead of just taking the documents. He needed to know what he was dealing with first." "Right," Adrian said. She said, "And Frank DeLuca just told him we're moving." "Probably," Adrian said. He was already calling Marco back. "Change of timeline," he said when Marco picked up. "Make it 10 minutes, and call me when the box is secured." He hung up. Gerald Morgan said, "What do we do?" And despite everything, the documents and the federal judge and the waiting and the shape of what tomorrow was going to require, Adrian almost smiled. He thought, there it is. There she is. The woman who wrote to him when the world had decided he was already gone. Still here, still herself, still somehow the steadiest thing in the room. He sat down at the kitchen table across from Gerald Morgan, and he waited for the tea, and outside the window the city moved around them, indifferent and loud and completely unaware that in this small apartment something that had been broken for 5 years was slowly, carefully beginning to be put right. Part 4. The Man Behind the Name. The tea went cold before anyone finished it. Gerald Morgan fell asleep in his chair sometime around 11 at night, the exhaustion of years of carrying a secret finally pulling him under. The moment he understood someone else was carrying it with him. Claire put a blanket over his shoulders without waking him. She stood there for a moment with her hand resting lightly on his arm, and Adrian watched her do it and thought about all the weight a person could carry when they loved someone who kept making it heavier. She came back to the table. She sat across from Adrian. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of the city outside and Gerald's steady breathing. She said, "Tell me something." He said, "What do you want to know?" She said, "The night before your release, the last night in the cell, what were you thinking about?" He looked at her. It was not the question he expected, but then she had never asked the questions he expected. He said, "I was thinking about the first letter you ever sent me. I had memorized most of it. Does anyone ask how you are? And I was thinking tomorrow I walk out of this place and I have to figure out who I am outside of it. And the only reference point I had for who I might actually be outside of what I was before, outside of the name and the organization and everything that came with it was you, was the man who existed in those letters." She was very still. She said, "You're more human than I expected." He said, "Careful, that might be the nicest thing anyone has said to me in 5 years." She almost smiled. Then something crossed her face, a more serious thing, and she said, "When Ressa calls back, whatever he decides, what does that actually look like? What happens in the room?" He said, "If he cooperates, my legal team coordinates with federal oversight. The testimony goes in formally. The evidence package goes in formally. The judge's conduct gets referred to the Judicial Conduct Review Board. It moves through the system." He paused. "Slowly. These things always move slowly. But they move." she said, and if he doesn't cooperate, he said, then we release everything simultaneously, multiple channels, the oversight committee, the journalists, the federal contacts. When something hits that many points at once, it can't be buried. The system doesn't always work, but it works better when you don't give anyone a single point to suppress. She nodded slowly, processing. She said, "You've been planning this since before you got out." He said, "I've been planning this since year 2. She said, "Year 2. He said, "When my conviction was first appealed, and the appeal was denied on procedural grounds that didn't make legal sense. That's when I knew the construction went deeper than I had originally thought. So I had Marco start building the surrounding case from the outside, while I worked the inside angle." He paused. "Your father's documents were the piece we didn't have, the center of it. Everything else was peripheral without a documented link between Ressa and the prosecution." She said, "And you found that link through me." He said, "Not the way anyone planned." She said, "Ressa used me to silence you, and it backfired." He said, "Because you weren't the person they thought you were when they chose you." She said, "What do you mean?" He said, "They chose you because they thought you were someone who could be controlled, a kind person with no power, and a vulnerable family member. Easy leverage. What they didn't count on was that you had spent 2 years actually knowing me, which means when the time came, you weren't afraid of the name. You were just afraid of losing the person." He paused. "Those are very different kinds of fear. One makes you compliant, the other makes you dangerous." She held his gaze for a long moment. She said, "I have never been described as dangerous in my life." He said, "You should start." Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. An unknown number, the same one from earlier. She looked at Adrian. He said, "Put it on speaker." She answered. He said, "I was thinking that I hoped that man was real, that he wasn't just something I had built because I needed to survive, that he could exist in the actual world." She said, "He's sitting at my father's kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night, helping take apart a federal corruption case because someone threatened the people he cares about." She looked at him steadily. "I think he's real." He said, "You're easier to talk to in person than I expected." Adrian said nothing, waited. Ressa said, "If I testify about the judge about the communication before the trial, that becomes a very large target on my back. The judge has friends, significant friends." Adrian said, "So do I. Now." Another pause. Longer. Ressa said, "The Morgan family debt. I want it on record that it's been forgiven, in writing, something that can't be revisited." Adrian said, "That I can provide directly." Ressa said, "Tonight." Adrian said, "Within the hour." Ressa said, "Then I'll make the call." Another pause. "Moretti, for what it's worth, this wasn't personal." Adrian said, "It was 5 years of my life. Don't tell me it wasn't personal." The line was quiet. Then Ressa said, "Fair enough." He hung up. Claire exhaled slowly. The sound of a person who had been holding something for a long time and finally set it down. She said, "Is it over?" Adrian said, "The hard part is beginning. The dangerous part is largely done." She said, "There's a difference." He said, "The dangerous part is where someone gets hurt. The hard part is where the system takes over, and you have to trust that it moves correctly." He picked up his phone. "I need to call Marco and start the documentation for the debt forgiveness. And I need to call our federal contact and let them know Ressa is coming in." She said, "Okay." I made the calls, 3 of them in quick succession, each one precise, specific, the language of a man who had spent years learning to communicate critical information in the fewest possible words. She watched him work, not with the specific anxiety of someone watching something they didn't understand, but with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were watching and wanted to understand it better. When he finished the last call, he put the phone down. Ressa said, "I want immunity from the debt charges. Not the conduct charges, I understand I can't escape those. But the financial structure I've been operating, I want that separated from the conduct case." Adrian said, "That's not my offer to make. That's a conversation between you and the federal oversight team." Ressa said, "Can you facilitate it?" Adrian said, "I can make an introduction. Whether they accept the terms is not in my hands." A pause. Ressa said, "The judge." Ressa's voice came through, and this time the smooth, measured quality of it was still present. But underneath it, something had changed. The difference between a man who is negotiating from a position and a man who has run the numbers and found they don't favor him. He said, "Mr. Moretti, I've been thinking about your offer." Adrian said, "And?" He said 16 years. He was 19 when he came into my organization. Grew up in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn I did. He paused. His older brother was someone I knew. When the brother died in an accident that was not entirely an accident, Marco had nowhere to go. I took responsibility. He stopped. Not a noble story, but it's the honest one. She said, "You feel responsible for him?" He said, "Yes." She said, "What did you decide?" He said, "Something that doesn't require the people around me to be afraid." She looked at him. She said, "In one of your letters you said you were afraid that when you got out you would walk back into the same man you were before, that the person you'd become in the letters wouldn't survive contact with the real world." He said, "I remember." She said, "I think he survived." He said, "Ask me again in a year." She said, "All right." The words landed between them. All right. Not a casual phrase. A commitment. The specific acceptance of being invited into the future of something. They both heard it. Neither of them moved away from it. Gerald Morgan stirred in his chair, made a small sound, settled back into sleep. Adrian said quietly, "You should sleep too. Tomorrow is going to be long." She said, "I'm not tired." He said, "You've been running on adrenaline since this morning." She said, "So have you." He said, "I slept in a 6x8 cell for 5 years. I'm accustomed to functioning on very little." She said, "That's not something to be proud of." He said, "No, it's not." She looked at him. Then she said, "The drawer." He said, "What about it?" She said, "The letters I never sent. I want to give them to you." He was very still. She said, "Not tonight, but I want you to have them. They were written to you. They should belong to you." She said, "Is that why you're working to make things legitimate? The organization because of him?" He was quiet for a moment. "Partly," he said. "Partly because of a lot of people who ended up inside something I built without fully understanding what I was asking them to carry." He looked at her. "And partly because I spent 5 years in a cell with nothing but time and letters, and I got very clear about what I wanted to spend the next part of my life building." She said, "Because they were real. Even if I couldn't send them, they were the realest thing I had written in 2 years, and I couldn't make myself destroy something real just because circumstances made it inconvenient." She paused. "I kept thinking maybe someday. Maybe there would be a someday where it was safe." He said, "Here it is." She said, "Here it is." The apartment was very quiet. Then his phone rang. Marco's name on the screen. He answered it. Marco said, "Someone in Ressa's network made a call before Ressa shut it down. One of the people who knew the documentation existed contacted the judge's office within the last hour, told him what was coming." A pause. "The judge has connections to 2 sitting senators and a deputy director at the FBI. He's going to try to get ahead of this." Adrian said, "How fast?" Marco said, "Fast. He's been on the phone for the last 40 minutes. I have someone monitoring his communications through a channel I'd rather not explain in detail right now. He's calling in every favor he has." Adrian said, "What does that mean for our timeline?" Marco said, "It means 8 o'clock tomorrow morning is too late. If we don't move the evidence package tonight before he can get his people positioned, we risk having this suppressed at the intake level. He has enough reach to bury a referral before it ever becomes a formal case." Adrian was on his feet before Marco finished speaking. He said, "What do you need?" Marco said, "Authorization to release the full package tonight, all 4 channels simultaneously. We don't wait for the formal process. We go public and institutional at the same time. The moment it hits the journalists, it can't be buried, and the institutional channels have to respond." Adrian said, "Do it." He said, "That window has closed. Do it." A pause. Then Marco said, "Sending in 3 minutes." He hung up. Claire was on her feet. She had heard enough from his side of the call to understand the shape of what had happened. She said, "It's going public." He said, "Tonight. Everything. The judge is trying to suppress it, so we're not giving him time." She said, "What does that mean for us right now tonight physically?" He said, "It means in about 4 hours our names are going to be attached to a major federal misconduct case. In about 6 hours journalists are going to be looking for us." He looked at her steadily. "And it means we need to be somewhere else before that happens, somewhere I control, where I can manage the next 48 hours properly." She said, "New York." He said, "Yes." She looked at her father's sleeping figure. He said, "He comes too. I'm not leaving him here once this breaks. She said, he's going to wake up in a very different world. He said, yes, one where no one can use his mistakes against him anymore. She looked at Adrian for a moment, the look of someone taking stock, running every variable through a calculation that was also emotional, which is the hardest kind to run. Then she went to her father. She put her hand on his shoulder. She said his name twice quietly. Gerald Morgan opened his eyes, disoriented, then focusing, then taking in Adrian standing at the edge of the kitchen and the expression on his daughter's face. He said, "What happened?" She said, "Everything changed. We have to go." Gerald said, "Go where?" She said, "With him, for now." Gerald looked at Adrian, then back at his daughter. Then he did the thing that in Adrian's experience fathers of a certain kind did when they had run out of options and still wanted their children to know they were paying attention. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Then I'm ready." They were out of the apartment in 11 minutes. Adrian's car was waiting. His driver had been outside the building for the last 2 hours on Marco's instruction, because Marco had been anticipating this possibility before Adrian had, which was why Marco was invaluable. In the car, Gerald Morgan sat in the back with his hands folded in his lap and looked out the window at the city passing by. He said nothing. But he was not the same person who had been sitting at that kitchen table a month ago or a year ago or 6 years ago when he had made the first in a series of decisions that had cost everyone around him something real. How as a man watching the city, he had lived in his whole life at midnight and understanding that by morning it was going to look different. Not because the city had changed, because he had. Claire sat beside Adrian in the front. She said quietly enough that her father couldn't hear, "When it goes public, what do you think they're going to say about you?" He said, "About me specifically." She said, "Yes, the story is going to be convicted criminal exonerated by evidence of prosecutorial misconduct and corruption. But you're still," she stopped, "you're still who you were before the trial, the things you built, the way you built them." He said, "Yes." She said, "Does that bother you that the story is complicated?" He said, "My whole life has been complicated. I stopped expecting the simple version." She said, "People are going to write what they want to write." He said, "Yes." She said, "Some of them are going to say you orchestrated all of this, that the evidence package is a power play, that you manipulated the people around you to serve your own interests." He said, "Some of them will be partly right." She said, "Which part?" Marco said, "Adrian, once I do this, there's no structured negotiation. Ressa's cooperation is still valuable, but it's no longer the central mechanism. The evidence stands on its own. This becomes a fully public case." Adrian said, "I know." Marco said, "And you become part of the story. Your name is in those documents. Your conviction, the appeal, the construction of the case against you. All of it." He said, "I know." Marco said, "You wanted to do this quietly." He said, "The part where my own exoneration matters to me. I'm not going to pretend it doesn't. I spent 5 years in a place I was put dishonestly. That matters." He paused. "But what also matters is that 3 federal officials, 1 prosecutor turned judge, and 1 man named Ressa built something that could have been done to anyone. It was done to me because I was a convenient target with a complicated enough history that no one would look too closely." She said, "So it's both." He said, "It's always both. I've never met a person whose motivations were entirely clean. The ones who pretend otherwise are the ones you should watch most carefully." She looked out the window. She said, "You sound like someone who's been thinking about this for a long time." He said, 5 years, 3 months, and 11 days. She said, "Right." They drove. The highway opened up, and the city fell behind them, and the road ahead was the particular quality of darkness that exists when you are moving towards something instead of away from it. At some point, Gerald Morgan fell asleep again in the back seat. Claire said, "Adrian." He said, "Yes." She said, "I want to tell you something, and I need you to just hear it without fixing anything or responding strategically. Just hear it." He said, "Okay." She said, "When I wrote that first letter to you, the 2 paragraphs, the 'Does anyone ask how you are?'" She paused. "I was sitting at my desk on a Thursday afternoon, and I had the newspaper in front of me, and I had been having the kind of day where everything I did felt like it was happening behind glass, like I was present in my own life, but not connected to any of it. And I read your name, and I thought that man is behind actual glass, actual walls, and still I'm the one who feels invisible." He said nothing, because she had asked him not to. He just drove. She said, "And then they took it from me. They took the one thing that was just mine, and I couldn't tell anyone why I'd stopped or what it had meant or how much it had cost me to walk away from it. I just had to carry it, and I did." She exhaled. "But I want you to know, in case it wasn't clear, it cost me a lot." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" She stopped. "I wrote to you because I needed to feel like I was doing something real, something that required the actual me, not the performed version of me that I showed everyone at work and in my family." She was quiet for a moment. "And then you wrote back, and then you kept writing back. And slowly I realized I wasn't writing to help you anymore. I was writing because it was the one part of my week where I felt like myself." He said the last 3 months in that cell. He kept his eyes on the road. "I had 11 weeks between when your letters stopped and when I was released. And in those 11 weeks, I went to a place inside myself that I haven't fully come back from yet." He paused. "It wasn't about the letters specifically. It was what the silence represented. It was the first time in my adult life I had let myself depend on something, on someone. Not for power or resources or strategic advantage." She said, "Because it hurts." He said, "Because it hurts." She said, "But you did it anyway. You let it matter." He said, "By the time I understood it was happening, it was already too late to protect myself from it." She said, "That's how it works." He said, "I'm learning that." She said, "For what it's worth, you were worth the cost." He looked at her, just briefly, then back at the road. He said, "You too." Gerald Morgan made a sound in the back seat. They both went quiet. He settled. Then Claire said, "The letters I kept writing after I stopped sending them, the ones in the drawer, some of them are just updates. What happened that week, what I was thinking about. But some of them are—" She stopped. "Some of them are things I didn't know how to say when we were actually corresponding, things I was working up to." He said, "Like what?" She said, "Things about how I felt, about what was happening between us. I kept starting to write it in real letters, and then I'd second-guess myself. You were in prison. I didn't want to—" She stopped again. "I didn't want to put something into the space between us that you couldn't get away from. It felt unfair. So I kept it in the unsent ones instead." He said, "And now," she said, "now it seems like most of the things I was being careful about don't apply anymore." He said, "No, they don't." She said, "So, when this is done, when the next 48 hours are behind us, and the case is moving, and the world knows what it knows, I want to start from where we actually were. Not from scratch, not pretending the letters were just letters. From where we actually were." He said, "Where were we?" She said, "Honestly." He said, "Always." She said, "We were two people who had told each other more truth than most people tell anyone in a lifetime, who had figured out something real about each other through the most limited possible medium. Who were, if we're being completely accurate about it already, halfway to something neither of us had ever had before." He said, "Halfway." She said, "I'm allowing for the fact that we'd never been in the same room before yesterday." He said, "A reasonable allowance." She said, "I thought so." He said, "Then we start from halfway." She said, "Yes." He said, "And we figure out the rest." She said, "Yes." He drove in silence for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth, you were not what I imagined, in any way." She said, "Is that bad?" He said, "No. What I imagined was something I built from words. It was real, but it was incomplete. What you actually are is—" He stopped, considered. "More." She said, "More than what?" He said, "More than I knew to imagine." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she faced forward. She said, "You know, for a man described in every newspaper article I ever read as cold and calculating and devoid of human sentiment," he said, "terrible reputation." She said, "Completely inaccurate." He said, "Don't tell anyone. I've spent a long time cultivating that." She laughed. A real one, small but genuine. The first time he had heard it in person. He had imagined her laugh from the letters. He had built it from the rhythm of her sentences and the way her humor appeared sideways, unexpected, always sharp underneath its gentleness. He had been wrong about it, too. It was better. His phone lit up on the dashboard. Marco. A text this time. 4 words. Package sent. All channels. Adrian looked at the message. Then he said to Claire, "It's done. It's out." She said, "Right now." He said, "Right now." She exhaled. "What happens next?" He said, "The world reads it in the morning. The institutional channels respond by noon. The judge's people try to manage the story and fail because there are too many points of release to contain." He paused. And by tomorrow afternoon, Carmine Ressa makes a phone call to a federal prosecutor because he's smart enough to know that being first is better than being last. She said, and us. He said, us. She said, where do we fit in tomorrow afternoon? He said, somewhere no one can reach for a while. He glanced at her. You've been available to everyone for a very long time. Your students, your father, strangers in prison cells who needed someone to tell them they were still human. He held her gaze for just a moment. You are allowed to be unavailable for a few days. She said, you sound like you've thought about this. He said, I've been thinking about it since year 3. She said, year 3. He said, that was when I stopped thinking of you as a pen pal and started thinking of you as something else. And I started thinking about what it would actually look like. To be in the same place at the same time. To have a conversation that didn't require waiting 3 weeks for the other person to respond. She said, what did you imagine? He said something like this, but quieter. She said, we did have a federal corruption case in the middle of it. He said, yes, that was not in the original version. She almost smiled again. He was learning the geography of her expressions, the specific quality of the almost smile which appeared when she found something genuinely funny but was still holding some part of herself in reserve. I was beginning to understand what it would take for her to stop holding that reserve. Time, mostly. And that was the one thing he had now. Gerald Morgan said from the back seat, not asleep after all. Are we almost there? Claire turned. Almost, Dad. He said, good. My back hurts. She said, you were sleeping. He said, I wasn't sleeping. I was resting my eyes. Adrian said, we'll be there in 40 minutes. Gerald said, good. A pause. Then, Moretti. Adrian said, yes. Gerald said, my daughter is very important to me. Adrian said, I know. He drove in silence and thought about the morning, about what the world was going to look like when the evidence package hit every channel simultaneously, about what it meant to have spent 5 years building a case from the inside of the thing that was supposed to contain you and coming out the other side with something that might actually matter. Gerald said, she doesn't always know how important she is to herself. She spends a lot of time making sure everyone around her is okay, and not enough time, you know. Adrian said, I know. Gerald said, good. Another pause. Your tea was better than hers, by the way. Don't tell her. Claire said, I can hear you, Dad. Gerald said, I know. He closed his eyes again. Adrian drove. He thought about the judge, about Ressa, about the corrupted officials, about the machinery that had been constructed to eliminate him, and had instead, through a chain of events no one could have predicted, connected him to the one person who had refused to let him be eliminated. He thought about a woman who stopped on a sidewalk to acknowledge a golden tree because she felt like someone should. I thought of all the things that had ever happened to him. The most powerful was 2 paragraphs written on ordinary paper by someone who simply wanted to ask how he was. He thought I was wrong. Power without humanity doesn't just mean nothing. Power without humanity is the thing that built the prison that held me. And humanity, the simple, unremarkable, ordinary act of it, is the thing that got me out. I thought she saved me, not from prison, from the version of myself I would have returned to without her. And ahead of them the road opened up, dark and straight and full of forward motion, and the city fell completely away behind them, and the sky above was the particular deep dark that comes just before the light starts to change, when everything is still holding its breath. And Adrian Moretti drove through it with a woman sleeping in the seat beside him and her father resting his eyes in the back, and 43 pages of evidence already moving through the world, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the thing he felt was not power, not control, not the cold, calculating certainty he had built his life on. The thing he felt was something much simpler. He felt like himself. Part 5. The letter that changed everything. Gerald Morgan walked through the door, looked around once, said, "This is very large," in a voice that suggested he was not entirely sure how to feel about that, and then allowed himself to be shown to a guest room where he was asleep within 4 minutes of his head touching the pillow. Claire heard his breathing change through the wall and felt something release in her chest that had been locked tight for longer than she could pinpoint. She stood in the hallway outside his door for a moment. He considered the question seriously, the way she had noticed he considered everything, not as a performance of thoughtfulness, but as an actual process. Like he had decided a long time ago that questions deserved real answers and had never stopped applying that standard. He said, "I think so," Ask me again in 12 hours. She said, deal. She sat on one of the counter stools. He refilled the glass and set it in front of her without being asked. She drank. Then she went to find Adrian. He was in the kitchen, not doing anything particularly purposeful, standing at the counter with a glass of water, phone face down beside him, looking at nothing specific. The posture of a man whose mind was still running at full speed, while the rest of him had temporarily run out of tasks. She said, he's asleep. He said, good. She said, are you? He looked at her. Am I asleep? She said, are you okay? That's what I meant. She said, what time do you think it breaks the story? He said, the journalists have it now, probably 2-3 hours before the first piece goes live. The institutional channels are slower. Those will start responding by mid-morning. He paused. By noon tomorrow, we'll know whether the judge tries to fight it or whether he understands his position. She said, what do you think he'll do? He said, fight first, then fold. Men like him always do. They built their entire identity on the belief that they were untouchable. When the evidence proves otherwise, they spend about 48 hours trying to find another angle, and when that fails, they negotiate. She said, and Ressa. He said, you wrote me a letter in October of that year. You had been working with a student, a 19-year-old kid, who had come into the program completely defeated. You'd been working with him for months, and in the letter you told me about the day he came in and told you he'd been accepted to a state university program, and he had stood in your office doorway and said, I almost didn't come back. And you didn't know what to do with that. You wrote, he said, already negotiating. Marco got a message 2 hours ago. He's asking for a formal meeting with the federal contacts by Monday. He almost smiled. He moved faster than I expected, which means he's more afraid than he let on. She said, good. He said, yes. She was quiet for a moment, looking at her water glass. Then she said, I keep thinking about something you said on the drive, about year 3, about when you stopped thinking of me as a pen pal. He said, yes. He said, I read that letter and I thought this is a person who measures her own worth by whether she has been useful to someone else. And I understood that because I had spent my entire life doing exactly the same thing, just through a completely different mechanism. Power instead of kindness. But the same root, the same need to justify your own existence through your effect on someone else. He paused. And I thought someone should tell her that she exists regardless, that she doesn't have to earn it. He looked at her steadily. And then I thought, I want to be the one who tells her that, not as a thing I do for her, but because she is the specific person I want to spend time convincing. The kitchen was very quiet. She said, that was year 3. He said, October, 3rd week. She said, I remember that letter. He said, I thought you might. She said, I wrote it because I didn't know where else to put it. I couldn't say it to anyone in my real life. It would have sounded, she stopped. It would have sounded like I needed reassurance. And I didn't want to be someone who needed reassurance. He said, why not? She said, because reassurance felt like asking for something. And I spent a long time not asking for things. He said, why? She said, because asking for things meant admitting you needed them. And needing things meant being vulnerable. And being vulnerable, he said, hurt. She said, yes. He said, I know. She said, I know you know. They held each other's gaze across the kitchen counter. The specific quality of two people who have said something important and are deciding what to do with the space it creates. Then her phone buzzed. She looked at it. An alert from a news app. She turned the screen toward him. The headline read, Federal judge implicated in prosecutorial misconduct evidence package reveals corruption spanning 5 years. Beneath it, in smaller text, convicted organized crime figure. Adrian Moretti's case at center of explosive new evidence. She looked at Adrian. He looked at the headline. She said, it started. He said, yes. She said, how do you feel? He said, like 5 years just became something other than wasted. She set the phone down. She said, I want to show you something. She set the bundle on the counter between them. She said, the drawer. He looked at the papers. He did not reach for them. He said, all of them. She said, all of them. I grabbed them before we left. I wasn't sure why. Habit, maybe. Or maybe I knew the someday had finally come. He said, can I? She said, they're yours. She went to the bag she had brought, small, packed fast, the essentials of a person who had learned somewhere along the way to be ready to move quickly. She reached inside and she pulled out a bundle wrapped in a rubber band. Papers, folded some of them, others flat. The handwriting on them was hers. He recognized it immediately. The same careful, deliberate letters that had first appeared in his cell 7 months into a sentence he was never supposed to survive with his humanity intact. He picked them up carefully. The rubber band was old, slightly brittle. The papers had the weight of things that had been handled many times. He did not open them yet. He just held them. He said, "How many?" She said, 31 over 8 months. He looked at her. 8 months. She said, "I kept writing for 8 months after I stopped sending them." He said nothing, but something moved through his face that he did not attempt to control. She said, "The last one, the most recent one, I wrote it 6 days before you got out. I didn't know your release date exactly. She paused. "I had been watching the appeal news. I knew it was close. And I wrote one more because I thought if this is the last one, I want to say everything I didn't say while I was still sending them." He said, "What did you say?" She said, "Read it." He looked at the bundle. He found the one on the outside newest, the paper slightly less worn than the others. He unfolded it. He read it. She watched him read it. She had the particular anxiety of someone who had said something very true in a space they believed was private, and was now watching someone enter that space for the first time. Not regret, not second-guessing, just the specific vulnerability of being known. He read it twice. Then he folded it and held it in both hands. She said, "I know. That's what made it strange. You were in the most restricted situation imaginable, and somehow the conversations we had made me feel like I had more room to move in my own life." She paused. "I started saying no to things I didn't want to do. I started playing the piano when Mrs. Hennessy could definitely hear me. I started telling my students things I actually believed instead of things I thought they needed to hear." She looked at him. "All of that was because of you." He said, "The last letter I sent you, before the silence. I told you that you didn't need to earn the right to take up space." She said, "Yes." He said, "Did you believe it?" She said, "I'm starting to." He said, "Good, keep going." She almost laughed. That small, real laugh that he had heard for the first time in the car and was already storing as something essential. Then his phone rang. "Marco, 5 in the morning." He answered. Marco said, "3 things. First, the story is everywhere. 6 outlets published within 20 minutes of each other. It's trending. It's not going away." A pause. "Second, the judge's office released a statement an hour ago. Blanket denial, no specifics. Which means his lawyers saw the evidence and told him denial was the only play left, which means they know he can't actually contest it." Adrian said, "And the third thing," Marco said, "Are you ready for that?" Adrian looked at Claire across the kitchen counter. She was watching him with the focused, steady attention that he had first encountered through 2 paragraphs on ordinary paper and had not been free of since. He said, "Yes." Marco said, "I'll have the meeting arranged by 8. Get some sleep." He hung up. Claire said, "What was the third thing?" He told her. Claire was watching Adrian's face. She saw the shift. She had learned in the last 36 hours what his face looked like when something landed harder than expected. He said, "Set the meeting, neutral location, my counsel present." Marco said, "Already working on it." Adrian, a pause. "If what Ressa is suggesting is accurate. If the judge really was the floor and not the ceiling. This gets a lot larger than one federal misconduct case." Adrian said, "I know." She processed it. He watched her do it, the quick internal movement of a person who was smart enough to understand implications and honest enough not to pretend they didn't. She said the judge was the floor. He said, "That's what Ressa said." She said, "Which means there are people above the judge who were also involved." He said, "That's what it suggests." She said, "How far does this go?" He said, "I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out." Marco said, "Ressa called, not a message. He called personally. He wants to meet with you directly, tomorrow. He says he has additional information that wasn't in the documents Gerald Morgan found, information that goes further than the judge." Adrian was still. "Further how?" Marco said. He wouldn't say specifically, but he said, and I'm quoting, "The judge wasn't the ceiling, he was the floor." The air in the kitchen changed. She said, "Adrian." She said it in the specific way she had of saying his name when she needed him to stop moving forward for one moment and just be present. He had noticed it for the first time in her father's apartment, and he was noticing it again now. He stopped. She said, "Before this gets bigger, before tomorrow and Ressa and whatever is above the judge and all of it." She looked at him. "I want you to know something." He said, "Tell me." She said, "When I wrote to you the first time, those 2 paragraphs, I told myself I was doing it because it was the right thing to do, because someone should." She paused. "But I think the honest truth is that I was also doing it because I was lonely. And because I had read your file and something in it made me think there is a person in there who is also lonely. And maybe 2 lonely people can be useful to each other even through prison walls." She stopped. He said, "Neither did I." She said, "I know. But I need you to know that nothing about my choice to write to you was strategic. It was not connected to my father's debt. I didn't know about Ressa or the documents or any of it when I wrote that first letter. She stopped. "I just saw someone who needed someone, and I happened to be a person who was very good at being someone for people, and it got out of hand." He said, "It got out of hand." He said, "Claire, I spent 2 years learning how to read you through the way you structured sentences. I know the difference between when you were being careful and when you were being honest. Every single letter you sent me was honest." He held her gaze. "I never doubted that." She exhaled. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." She said, "In the best possible way." A pause. "I need you to know that it was real from the beginning, that I wasn't a plant or an angle or a mechanism. I was just a person who wrote a letter." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" She said, "Now I'm going to sleep, because it's 5 in the morning, and my father is in the next room, and the world is about to be very loud, and I would like 4 hours of quiet first." He said, "Good idea." She picked up her bag. She walked toward the hallway. Then she stopped. She turned back. She said, "One more thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "The letter you wrote me, year 2, when I told you I was afraid I wasn't doing enough, that everything I gave to other people left nothing for me." She paused. "You wrote you are not someone who needs to earn the right to take up space." He said, "I remember." She said, "I want you to know you're not either. Whatever they said about you in those courtrooms, whatever was built to make you into a symbol instead of a person, whatever you did before, and whatever you're still carrying from it." She looked at him steadily. "You don't have to earn the right to be who you are now. You already are." He did not speak. She nodded once. Then she went to sleep. By the time Gerald Morgan appeared in the kitchen looking for coffee and finding Adrian at the counter with the last letter in his hand, the world outside had already changed completely. 3 news networks were running the story. The judge's office had released a second statement more defensive than the first, which confirmed what Adrian had predicted. The denial was the only play left, and they both knew it couldn't hold. 2 senators had already called for a formal inquiry. Gerald poured himself coffee. He looked at Adrian and the papers on the counter. He did not ask. He said, "She kept those for 8 months." Adrian said, "Yes." Gerald said, "She writes to everyone. She always has. Letters, notes. She wrote to her grandmother every week until her grandmother died." He sipped his coffee. "I used to tease her about it. Said nobody writes letters anymore." He stopped. "I was wrong about a lot of things." Adrian said, "She got it from somewhere." Gerald looked at him. "From her mother," he said. "Her mother wrote. Letters, stories, everything. She died when Claire was 12. He paused. "Claire took it up about a year after. I think she was trying to, I don't know, keep something alive, something of her mother's." Adrian held that information carefully. "I thought about a 12-year-old girl picking up a pen because she had lost something and needed a way to stay connected to it." He thought about how that became a practice, and how that practice became a program, and how that program eventually produced 2 paragraphs on ordinary paper delivered to a prison cell in Detroit. "I thought nothing about this was an accident. Not in the mystical sense, in the human sense. Claire had been building toward this her entire life without knowing what she was building toward." He said, "She told me she almost studied music." He stood in the kitchen for a long time after she left. The bundle of unsent letters was still on the counter. He looked at them. He thought about 31 letters written over 8 months to someone who was never supposed to receive them. He thought about the specific courage that required not the dramatic kind of courage, not the kind you built yourself up for, the quiet kind, the kind where you keep doing the true thing even when you can't show it to anyone. Gerald looked at him directly, man to man, the way he had not quite managed in his kitchen the night before when everything was still in motion. He said, "I need to say something to you, and I need to say it properly." Adrian said, "All right." Gerald said, I made decisions that put my daughter in an impossible position. I took on a debt I had no business taking on, and I let it grow until it became something that could be used against her. And in doing that, I cost her something between her and you that I didn't understand the value of until it was already gone. He stopped. I can't undo that. I know I can't, but I want you to understand that I know what I cost her, and I know what I cost you. Adrian said, You don't owe me anything. Gerald said, I'm not apologizing to you because I think I owe you something. I'm apologizing because what I did was wrong, and she deserved better, and so did you. He held Adrian's gaze. And because I think you're going to be in her life, and I'd like us to start honestly. Adrian said, That's all I ever want. Gerald nodded. Then he picked up his coffee again. He looked at the news on the small television mounted in the corner of the kitchen that he had turned on quietly while Adrian was reading. The judge's face on the screen. Reporters outside a courthouse. He said, This is really happening. Adrian said, Yes. He said, Will she be safe through all of this? Adrian said, Yes. He said, You're sure? Adrian said, I have never been more certain of anything. Gerald said, Piano. She was very good. Her mother taught her. He set down his coffee. She doesn't play for anyone, just alone. She said once that it felt too private to do in front of people, like something she needed to keep for herself. He paused. She played for 3 hours the week she stopped sending letters to you. I didn't know why then. I know now. Adrian said nothing. She poured herself a cup. She stood at the counter and drank it and watched the news, and something in her posture was different from any posture he had seen on her in the last 2 days. Less bracing, less held. The posture of someone who has set down a weight they have been carrying so long they had stopped noticing it was there. She said without looking away from the television, Adrian. He said yes. Gerald Morgan looked at him for a long moment, the look of a father running a final calculation. Then he nodded slowly and turned back to his coffee. Claire appeared at 9:20. She had slept 4 hours and looked like someone who had used those 4 hours with complete efficiency, fully present alert, already processing the morning. She saw the news on the television immediately. She stood and watched it for 30 seconds. Then she said, the judge released another statement. She said, The letters I sent you, the real ones when we were corresponding, do you still have them? He said, Every one. She turned and looked at him. She said, You kept them. He said, Did you think I wouldn't? She said, I thought. She stopped. They were just paper. I thought in a prison they'd get lost or confiscated or... Gerald cleared his throat unnecessarily. They both looked at him. He was staring very deliberately at the television. Claire said, Dad. He said, I'm watching the news. Very important. She looked at Adrian. He looked at her. Something passed between them, quick, warm, entirely private. At 11:17, Marco arrived. He came in with 3 other people, 2 lawyers and a federal contact named Delgado, whom Adrian had known for a decade through channels that had always been carefully maintained as neutral. Delgado was a small man who dressed like someone who had decided at 35 to stop caring about appearance and had never revisited that decision. He had the specific quality of competence that never felt the need to announce itself. He shook Adrian's hand. He looked at Claire. He said, I had Marco keep them. When the cell was searched, he made sure they were held separately with my legal documents, untouchable. He paused. I was not going to let anything happen to them. She held his gaze. She said, That's... She stopped again. He waited. She shook her head slightly like she was shaking something loose. Then she said, Thank you. He said, They belong to both of us. They spent the next 3 hours in Adrian's living room going through the evidence package, the timeline, the formal process that would now unfold. Delgado explained what the Judicial Conduct Review Board could and could not do. The lawyers explained what Adrian's own legal position looked like in light of the documented misconduct. Gerald Morgan sat at the end of the couch and answered questions in a voice that grew steadier as